Going to be doing some, this is a request, going to be doing some reading with gum chewing in The Witcher. I just grabbed The Last Wish. I will read from the beginning of it. The Witcher. Later, it was said, the man came from the north, from Roper's Gate. He came on foot, leading his laden horse by the bridle. It was late afternoon, and the ropers, saddlers, and tanners' stalls were already closed. The street empty. It was hot, but the man had a black coat thrown over his shoulders. He drew attention to himself. He stopped in front of the old Narracourt Inn, stood there for a moment, listened to the hubbub of voices. As usual at this hour, it was full of people. The stranger did not enter the old Narracourt. He pulled his horse further down the street, to another tavern, a smaller one, called the Fox. Not enjoying the best of reputations, it was almost empty. The innkeeper raised his head above a barrel of pickled cucumbers and measured the man with his gaze. The outsider, still in his coat, stood stiffly in front of the counter, motionless and silent. "What will it be?" "Beer," said the stranger. His voice was unpleasant. The innkeeper wiped his hands on his canvas apron and filled a chipped earthenware tankard. The stranger was not old, but his hair was almost entirely white. Beneath his coat he wore a worn leather jerkin laced up at the neck and shoulders. As he took off his coat, those around him noticed that he carried a sword, not something unusual in itself. Nearly every man in Wisdom carried a weapon, but no one carried a sword strapped to his back as if it were a bow or a quiver. The stranger did not sit at the table. With the few other guests, he remained standing at the counter, piercing the innkeeper with his gaze. He drew from the tankard. "I'm looking for a room for the night." "There's none," grunted the innkeeper, looking at the guest's boots, dusty and dirty. "Ask at the old Narracourt. I would rather stay here." "There is none." The innkeeper finally recognized the stranger's accent. He was Rivian. "I'll pay." The outsider spoke quietly, as if unsure, and the whole nasty affair began. A pockmarked beanpole of a man who, from the moment the outsider entered, had not taken his gloomy eyes from him, got up and approached the counter. Two of his companions rose behind him, no more than 2 paces away. "There's no room to be had here, you Rivian vagabond," rasped the pockmarked man, standing right next to the outsider. "We don't need people like you in Wisdom. This is a decent town." The outsider took his tankard and moved away. He glanced at the innkeeper, who avoided his eyes. It did not even occur to him to defend the Rivian. After all, who liked Rivians? "All Rivians are thieves," the pockmarked man went on, his breath smelling of beer, garlic, and anger. "Do you hear me, you bastard?" "He can't hear you. His ears are full of shit," said one of the men with him, and the second man cackled. "Pay and leave," yelled the pocked man. Only now did the Rivian look at him. "I'll finish my beer." "We'll give you a hand," the pockmarked man hissed. He knocked the tankard from the stranger's hand, and simultaneously grabbing him by the shoulder, and dug his fingers into the leather strap which ran diagonally across the outsider's chest. One of the men behind him raised a fist to strike. The outsider curled up on the spot, throwing the pockmarked man off balance. The sword hissed in its sheath and glistened briefly in the dim light. The place seethed. There was a scream, and one of the few remaining customers tumbled towards the exit. A chair fell with a crash, and earthenware smacked hollowly against the floor. The innkeeper's lips trembling looked at the horribly slashed face of the pocked man, who, clinging with his fingers to the edge of the counter, was slowly sinking from sight. The other two were lying on the floor, one motionless, the other writhing and convulsing in a dark, spreading puddle. A woman's hysterical scream vibrated in the air, piercing the ears as the innkeeper shuddered, caught his breath, and vomited. The stranger retreated toward the wall, tense and alert. He held a sword in both hands, sweeping the blade through the air. No one moved. Terror like cold mud was clear on their faces, paralyzing limbs and blocking throats. 3 guards rushed into the tavern with thuds and clangs. They must have been close by. They had truncheons wound with leather straps at the ready, but at the sight of the corpses drew their swords. The Rivian pressed his back against the wall, and with his left hand pulled a dagger from his boot. "Throw that down." One of the guards yelled with a trembling voice. "Throw that down, you thug. You're coming with us." The second guard kicked aside the table between himself and the Rivian. "Go get the men, Tresca," he shouted to the third guard, who stayed closer to the door. "No need," said the stranger, lowering his sword. "I'll come by myself." "You'll go, you son of a bitch, on the end of a rope," yelled the trembling guard. "Throw that sword down or I'll smash your head." The Rivian straightened. He quickly pinned his blade under his left arm and with his right hand raised towards the guard, swiftly drew a complicated sign in the air. The cloud of nails which studded his tunic from his wrists, the elbows flashed. The guards drew back, shielding their faces with their arms. One of the customers sprang up. Another darted to the door. The woman screamed again, wild and ear-splitting. "I'll come by myself," repeated the stranger in his resounding, metallic voice. "And the 3 of you will go in front of me. Take me to the castellon. I don't know the way." "Yes, sir," mumbled the guard. Dropping his head, he made toward the exit. Looking around tentatively, the other 2 guards followed him. Out backward, hastily, the stranger followed in their track, sheathing his sword and dagger. As they passed the tables, the remaining customers hid their faces from the dangerous stranger. Velorad, a castellan of wisdom, scratched his chin. He was neither superstitious nor faint-hearted, but he did not relish the thought of being alone with the white-haired man. At last he made up his mind. "Leave," he ordered the guards, "and you sit down." "No, not there, farther away, if you please." The stranger sat down. He no longer carried his sword or black coat. "I am Velorad, castellan, a wizen," said Velorad, toying with a heavy mace lying on a table. "And I'm listening. What do you have to say to me, you brigand? Before you were thrown into the dungeon, 3 killed in an attempted spell casting. Not bad. Not bad at all. Men are impaled for such things, and wizen, but I'm just a man, so I will listen to you before you're executed. Speak." The Rivian unbuttoned his jerkin and pulled out a wad of white goat leather. "You nail us crossways in taverns," he said quietly. "Is what written here true?" "Ah," Velogard grunted, looking at the runes etched into the leather. "So that's it. And I didn't guess it once. Yes, it's true. It's signed by Foltest, King of Temeria, Pontar, and Mahakam, which makes it true. A proclamation is a proclamation, Witcher, but law is law, and I take care of law and order in Wisdom. I will not allow people to be murdered. Do you understand?" The Rivian nodded to show he understood. Velorod snorted with anger. "You carry the Witcher's emblem." The stranger reached into his jerkin once more and pulled out a round medallion and a silver chain. He pictured the head of a wolf bearing its fangs. "And do you have a name?" "Any name will do. It's simply to make conversation easier." "My name is Geralt. Geralt, then, of Rivia, I gather, from your accent. Of Rivia." "Right. Do you know what, Geralt?" As Velorod slapped the proclamation, "Let it go. It's a serious matter. Many have tried and failed already. This, my friend, is not the same as roughing up a couple of scoundrels. I know this is my job, Velorod, and the proclamation offers a 3,000 Oren reward." 3,000, Velorod scowled. And the princess is a wife, or so the rumor says, although gracious Foltest has not proclaimed that. I'm not interested in the princess, Geralt said calmly. He was sitting motionless, his hands on his knees. Just in the 3,000. What time, sighed the castellan. What foul times. 20 years ago, who would have thought, even in a drunken stupor, that such a profession as a witcher would exist? Itinerant killers of basilisks, traveling slayers of dragons and vodniks. Tell me, Geralt, are you allowed beer in your guild? Certainly. Velorod clapped his hands. Beer, he called. And sit closer, Geralt. What do I care? The beer, when it arrived, was cold and frothy. Foul times, Velorod muttered, drinking deep from his tankard. All sorts of filth had sprung up. Markham in the mountains is teeming with bogeymen. In the past, it's just wolves howling in the woods, but now it's kobolds and spriggans. Wherever you spit, werewolves, or some other vermin. Fairies and rusalkas snatch children from villages by the hundreds. We have diseases never heard of before. It makes my hair stand on end. And now, to top it all, this. They pushed a wad of leather back across the table. It's not surprising, Geralt, that your witcher's service are in demand. The king's proclamation, Castellon. Geralt raised his head. Do you know the details? Velorod leaned back in his chair, locked his hands over his stomach. The details, yes, I know them. Not firsthand, perhaps, but from a good source. That's what I want. If you insist, then listen. Velorod drank some beer and lowered his voice. During the reign of Odmedel, his father, when our gracious king was still a prince, Foltest showed us what he was capable of, and he was capable of a great deal. We hoped he would grow out of it, but shortly after his coronation, Foltest surpassed himself jaw-droppingly. He got his own sister with child. Ada was younger, and they were always together, but nobody suspected anything except perhaps the queen. To get to the point, suddenly there is Ada with a huge belly, and Foltest talking about getting a wed to his sister. The situation was made even more tense because Vizimir of Novigrad wanted his daughter Dalka to marry Foltest and had already sent out his envoys. We had to restrain Foltest from consulting them, and lucky we did, or Vizimir would have torn our insides out. Then not without Ada's help, for she influenced her brother, we managed to dissuade the boy from a quick wedding. Well then, Ada gave birth. Now listen, because this is where it all starts. Only a few saw what she bore, but one midwife jumped from the tower window to her death, and the other lost her senses and remains dazed to this day. So I gather that the royal bastard girl was not comely, and she died immediately. No one was in a hurry to tie the umbilical cord, nor did Ada, to her good fortune, survive the birth. But then Foltest stepped in again. Wisdom dictated that the royal bastard should have been burned or buried in the wilderness. Instead, on the orders of our gracious king, she was laid to rest in a sarcophagus in the vaults beneath the palace. It's too late for your wisdom now, Geralt raised his head. One of the knowing ones should have been sent for. You mean those charlatans with stars on their hats? Of course. About 10 of them came running later when it became known what lay in the sarcophagus and what scrambled out of it at night. It didn't start manifesting straight away. Oh no. For 7 years after the funeral, there was peace. Then one night it was a full moon. There were screams in the palace, shouting and commotion. I don't have to tell you that this is your trade and you've read the proclamation. The infant had grown in the coffin, and how? Grown to have incredible teeth. In a word, she became a Striegel. Pity you didn't see the corpses I did, had you? You'd have taken a great detour to avoid wisdom. Geralt was silent. Then, as I was saying, Velorod continued. Foltest summoned a whole crowd of sorcerers. They all jabbered at the same time and almost came to blows with those staffs they carried to beat off the dogs, no doubt. Once they'd been set loose on them, and I think they regularly are, I'm sorry, Geralt, if you have a different opinion of wizards, no doubt you do in your profession, but to me, they're swindlers and fools. You witchers inspire greater confidence in men. At least you are more straightforward. Geralt smiled, but didn't comment. But to the point, the castellan peered into his tankard and poured some beer for himself and the Rivian, some of the sorcerers. Advice didn't seem so stupid. One suggested burning the Striegel together with the palace and the sarcophagus. Another advised chopping her head off. The rest were keen on driving aspen stakes into her body during the day, when the she-devil was asleep in her coffin, worn out by the night's delights. Unfortunately, one, a jester with a pointed hat and a bald pate, a hunchbacked hermit, argued it was magic. The spell could be undone, and the Striegel would turn into Foltest's little daughter, as pretty as a picture. Someone simply had to stay in the crypt throughout the night, and that would be that. After which you can imagine such a fool. He went to the palace for the night. Little of him was left in the morning only. I believe his hat and stick, but Foltest clung to this idea like a bird to a dog's tail. He forbade any attempt to kill the Striegel, and brought in charlatans from all corners of Wisdom to reverse the spell and turn her into princess. What colorful company. Twisted women, cripples, dirty and louse-ridden. It was pitiful. They went ahead and cast spells, mainly over a bowl and tankard. Of course, some were quickly exposed as frauds by Foltest to the council. A few were even hung on the palisades, but not enough for them. I would have hung them all. I don't suppose I have to say that. The Striegel, in the meantime, was getting her teeth into all sorts of people every now and again, and paying no attention to the fraudsters and their spells, or that Foltest was no longer living in the palace. No one lived there anymore. Bellerad paused, drank some beer, and the Witcher waited in silence. And so it's been for 7 years, Geralt, because she was born around 14 years ago. We've had a few other worries, like war with Vizimir of Novigrad, fought for real, understandable reasons, over the border post, not for some princesses or marriage alliance. Foltest sporadically hints at marriage and looks over portraits from neighboring courts, which he then throws down the privy. And every now and then, this mania seizes hold of him, and he sends horsemen out to look for new sorcerers. He promised reward to 3,000, has attracted any number of crank stray knights, even a shepherd known throughout the whole region as a Cretan. May he rest in peace. But the Striegel is still doing well. Every now and again she gets her teeth into someone. You get used to it. And at least those heroes trying to reverse the spell of use. The beast stuffs herself on the spot and doesn't roam beyond her palace. Foltest has a new palace, of course, quite a fine one. In 7 years, Geralt raised his head. In 7 years, no one has settled the matter. Well, no. Bellerad's gaze penetrated the Witcher because the matter can't be settled. We have to come to terms with it, especially Foltest, our gracious and beloved ruler. Who will keep nailing these proclamations over the crossroads, although there are fewer volunteers now. There was one recently, but he insisted on the 3,000 in advance, so he put him in a sack and threw him in the lake. There is still no shortage of fraudsters then. No, far from it, the castellan agreed, without taking his eyes off the Witcher. That's why you mustn't demand gold in advance when you go to the palace. If you go, I'll go. It's up to you, but remember my advice. As we're talking of the reward, there's been word recently about the second part of it. I mentioned it to you. The princess for a wife. I don't know who made it up, but if the Striegel looks the way they say, then it's an exceptionally grim joke. Nevertheless, there's been no lack of fools racing to the palace for a chance of joining the royal family. 2 apprentice shoemakers, to be precise. Why are shoemakers so foolish, Geralt? I don't know. And witchers, Castellon? Have they tried? There were a few, but when they heard the spell was to be lifted and the Striegel wasn't to be killed, they mostly shrugged and left. That's one of the reasons why my esteem for witches has grown, Geralt. And one came along younger than you, I forgot his name. If he gave it at all, he tried. And the fanged princess spread his entrails over a considerable distance. Geralt nodded. That was all of them. There was the other. Velerad remained silent for a while, and the Witcher didn't urge him on. Yes, the castellan said finally. There was one more. First, when Foltest threatened him, and then with the noose, if he killed or harmed the Striegel, he laughed and started packing his belongings. But then Velerad leaned across the table, lowered his voice to almost a whisper. Then he undertook the task. You see, Geralt, there are some wise men in high positions who've had enough of this whole affair. Rumor has it these men persuaded the Witcher in secret not to fuss around with spells, but to batter the Striegel to death until the king the spell had failed, that his dear daughter, had been killed off in self-defense. An accident at work. The king, of course, would be furious and refuse to pay an ordinary reward, but that would be an end to it. The witty Richter replied, we could chase Striegel ourselves for nothing. Well, what could we do? We collected money, bargained, but nothing came of it. Geralt raised his eyebrows. Nothing, repeated Velerad. The Witcher didn't want to try that first night. He trudged around, lay in wait, wandered about the neighborhood. Finally, they say he saw the Striegel in action, as she does not clamber from her crypt just to stretch her legs. He saw her and scampered that night without a word. Geralt's expression changed a little in what was probably supposed to be a smile. Those wise men, he said, they still have the money? No doubt. Witchers don't take payment in advance. No doubt they still do, said Velerad. Does a rumor say how much they offer? Velerad bared his teeth in a smile. Some say 800. Geralt shook his head. Others, murmured the castellan, talk of 1,000. Not much when you bear in mind that rumors like to exaggerate, and the king is offering 3,000. Don't forget about the betrothal. Velerad mocked. What are you talking about? It's obvious you won't get 3,000. How is it obvious? All right. Put this there. I'm going to stop there. I probably mispronounced some of the towns and stuff. I stumbled a few times there, but if you've watched the TV show, that is an episode based on that. This will obviously go in more detail than that and stuff, but I'll probably pick up again if you guys want to hear some more of this. But thanks for checking this out, and have a good day.